Ottawa has signed a memorandum of understanding with South Korea to bring auto manufacturing to Canada. The MOU, which is not binding, calls for closer industrial cooperation on the future of mobility. This includes talks on the auto sector. It was signed by Industry Minister Melanie Joly and her South Korean counterpart last week.
South Korea is redirecting its next wave of auto and battery production to Canada for one simple reason. Canada controls the inputs and the stability that determine who wins the EV race. Ottawa's new memorandum with Seoul comes at a moment when Canadian minerals, clean power capacity, and predictable policy have become more valuable than any incentive the U.S. can offer. As American tariff threats escalate and Hyundai's Georgia project collapses into immigration-driven delays, Korea is repositioning towards the only North American market that can guarantee long-term operational certainty. In this environment, Canada is no longer the fallback option. It is the strategic upgrade. Ottawa has signed a memorandum of understanding with South Korea focused on the future of mobility and automotive manufacturing. The document is non-binding, but it opens the door for collaboration on vehicles, components, batteries, and industrial clean tech systems. It also reinforces Canada's attempt to rebuild its auto sector after factory losses and shifting investment patterns. The agreement comes at a sensitive moment. South Korea is reconsidering the risk profile of its U.S. operations after the mass immigration raid at Hyundai's Georgia plant, an event that delayed the company's EV battery schedule and forced a structural review of workforce strategy. At the same time, Canada is facing the consequences of Trump's tariff doctrine, weakening export volumes and increasing political pressure on firms operating inside the North American market. This memorandum signals that both countries see value in a stable industrial partnership at a time when volatility is shaping decisions across the sector. South Korea is not moving toward Canada because of goodwill. It is moving because Canada holds the decisive industrial leverage, the minerals and clean energy backbone that determine who controls the EV supply chain. Canada has the nickel, lithium, cobalt, and graphite that Korean battery firms require to keep their global lead. The United States simply doesn't have equivalent reserves, nor does it have the permitting or regulatory stability to guarantee long-term access. For Korea, this is the real calculation. Production in Canada means proximity to minerals, predictable policy, clean electricity to meet ESG standards, and tariff-free entry into the U.S. market without the operational chaos that struck Hyundai in Georgia. Canada can offer a complete industrial chain. The U.S. can only offer a market wrapped in political volatility. Canada is not asking Korea for help. Korea is securing the one North American location where its EV strategy can actually function. The USMCA framework has become a constraint on strategic planning in North America, largely because Washington treats it as a political weapon instead of a trade agreement. Trump's warnings that Canada's outreach to China could trigger retaliation only underline that risk. Korea sees how quickly the U.S. can disrupt established supply chains. Canada, by contrast, offers a clean legal runway. Cooperation with Seoul fits comfortably within USMCA and avoids the political traps built around China. Korea knows that if it places new capacity inside the U.S., it becomes exposed to U.S. regulatory swings, immigration actions, and tariff whims. The Georgia raid proved the point. A project worth billions can be stalled, not because of economic concerns, but because a domestic enforcement agenda appeared overnight. Canada's regulatory rhythm may be slow, but it is stable, and for global manufacturers, stability is now worth more than tax breaks. Canada's auto sector has gaps, but those gaps are precisely what Korea can fill while gaining insulation from U.S. volatility. Ontario's job losses, the Stellantis exit, and GM's adjustments reflect a sector in transition. Korea sees opportunity, not decline. It sees an industrial ecosystem ready for reinvestment and a government willing to align provinces, incentives, and infrastructure to land high-value production. Most importantly, Korea sees what the U.S. no longer offers, a predictable environment. After the Georgia raid, Hyundai had to reassess whether political risk in America was compatible with long-term EV investment. Canada's immigration system, labor framework, and industrial policy do not deliver those shocks. It is a quieter, steadier platform where a multi-billion-dollar factory can operate without being caught in the path of a political headline. For Korean firms, the logic is simple. Canada minimizes risk and maximizes control over the inputs that matter. South Korea is rebalancing its global industrial map.
Even as a military ally of the United States, it cannot anchor its long-term auto and battery strategy to a country where tariffs shift overnight and enforcement agencies derail supply chains. Korea needs a second anchor point in North America, one that is stable, mineral-rich, and geopolitically neutral. Canada fits that role precisely. Ottawa is deepening ties with Korea, Japan, and ASEAN to create an Asia-facing economic corridor that reduces reliance on the U.S. market. For Seoul, this matches its own diversification agenda. And because Canada holds the mineral resources needed for Korea's battery independence, the partnership has strategic depth the U.S. cannot replicate. This is not Korea hedging. This is Korea repositioning, and Canada is the beneficiary.
The contrast within North America could not be sharper. Trump's model relies on threats, tariffs, and political pressure as primary economic tools. That environment forces companies into short-term defensive planning. Korea has seen the consequences firsthand. Its flagship U.S. project was derailed by a federal raid unrelated to industrial needs. Carney's model is the opposite: build optionality, diversify supply chains, and provide long-term certainty. Korea understands which environment protects its investment. Canada is not merely offering incentives, it is offering reliability, and reliability is now a competitive advantage. Public sentiment strengthens this shift. Canadians increasingly see the U.S. as an unstable partner, and Korea sees exactly the same dynamic. In North America's industrial competition, Carney is offering a floor, Trump is offering a gamble.
Korea's potential expansion into Canada fits a larger regional trend. As Washington becomes more unpredictable and Mexico remains the cost-efficient manufacturing base, Canada is emerging as the high-value, low-volatility hub for advanced manufacturing. If Korean firms choose Canada for EV assembly, battery modules, or materials processing, Ottawa could secure a tier of the EV value chain that the U.S. is struggling to retain. And if Washington tries to retaliate against Korean investment in Canada, it risks accelerating an even faster Korean shift northward. For Korea's planners, the comparative math is straightforward. Canada gives stability, minerals, and access. The U.S. gives market size, but with a political premium attached.
The Georgia raid was not a footnote. It was the warning sign Seoul could not ignore. It revealed that American domestic politics can override industrial strategy instantly, regardless of investment scale or diplomatic ties. Korea cannot anchor its global EV strategy around that level of uncertainty. Canada's MOU lands at the exact moment Korea is recalibrating. If the partnership deepens, a portion of the Asian EV supply chain will migrate north, rebalancing who holds industrial power in North America. For Canada, this is more than an agreement. It is the opening of a decade-long lane to capture the industries the U.S. is pushing away.
Canada's memorandum with South Korea marks more than a diplomatic milestone. It confirms a structural shift in North American manufacturing. Canada now holds the combination of critical minerals, clean power, predictable regulation, and aligned industrial policy that global automakers require. The United States does not. And the moment Hyundai's Georgia plant was thrown into chaos, Korea understood that distinction clearly. What this pact reveals is that Canada is constructing an EV and battery corridor rooted in assets Washington cannot imitate. When South Korea chooses to place part of its supply chain in Canada, it is acknowledging that Canada, not the U.S., offers the reliable foundation for next-generation manufacturing. It is acknowledging that Trump's tariff and enforcement-driven model introduces risks no investor can forecast. And it is acknowledging that Canada's long-term strategy aligns with global industrial needs in a way the U.S. approach simply does not. Canada is no longer trying to protect what remains of its auto sector. It is shaping the terms of North America's next industrial era. The real question now is whether Ottawa will move quickly enough to convert this opening into permanent production before Washington realizes the advantage Canada has already secured.
More than 300 South Korean workers were detained during that raid, suspected of living and working in the U.S. illegally.
Well, this is a low point right now in at least recent U.S.-South Korea relations. And really, relations are hugely important, we know.
From the perspective of companies, they will be concerned about disadvantageous treatment or facing difficulties when they're building factories in the United States. That could probably have a significant impact on direct investment in the U.S. in the future.
Hyundai could choose Canada for its next major North American plant, and this is far from impossible. In fact, after the chaos unleashed by the mass deportation raid in Georgia, Canada suddenly looks like the safer, more predictable, and more strategically aligned partner for South Korea's flagship automaker. What only months ago seemed like a US-centered expansion plan is now being quietly re-evaluated. Hyundai's confidence in the United States was shaken, Seoul was embarrassed, and investors across Asia started asking how long they can continue tolerating the political volatility Trump has reintroduced into America's economic landscape. In this moment of uncertainty, Canada is no longer a secondary option. It is emerging as a serious contender.
The turning point came in September 2025, when U.S. immigration authorities surged into the Hyundai LG battery plant in Elabel, Georgia, arresting almost 500 workers in what authorities called the largest industrial raid in modern American history. Overnight, a multi-billion-dollar clean energy project was thrown into paralysis. Construction stopped. Timelines evaporated. Hyundai's leadership was blindsided, and the South Korean government demanded immediate explanations from Washington. Hyundai described the event as shocking. LG Energy Solution called it disruptive and destabilizing. Reuters noted that several Korean corporations were now reconsidering their risk exposure inside the United States, especially in industries requiring large, specialized workforces. While this chaos unfolded, Canada was demonstrating a very different posture. At the APEC summit in Gyeongju, Prime Minister Mark Carney held substantive talks with South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. The two leaders reaffirmed their cooperation in energy, technology, defense, supply chains, and critical minerals. They signed a new security and defense cooperation partnership, an unprecedented step for Canada's engagement with Korea. At the exact moment the U.S. was breaking trust with Seoul, Canada was strengthening it.
For decades, Hyundai's North American strategy revolved around the United States. The market was huge, incentives were attractive, and political conditions appeared stable enough to justify long-term investment. But that calculation changed in Trump's second term. Tariffs fluctuate without consistency. Immigration enforcement is unpredictable, and supply chains can be disrupted not by economic conditions, but by political theatrics. Hyundai's experience in Georgia has made one thing clear: the United States can no longer guarantee the stable environment a multi-billion-dollar plant requires. Every year the risk grows, and the confidence that once anchored foreign investment is nowhere near what it used to be. Canada, by contrast, can offer exactly what the U.S. no longer can. Carney's government operates through consistent industrial strategy. Regulations are transparent. Immigration is treated as a strength, not a political weapon. And Canada's long-term emphasis on skilled labor, clean energy, and predictable policy gives investors something rare in North America: peace of mind.
We have what the world wants. Take on the energy side, we are an energy superpower. Our top 5 in 10 of the world's most important critical minerals. We are a leading developer of AI. We have the resources the world needs. We have the talent to turn that potential into growth. We're a reliable partner. We're connected more than anyone else through trading relationships with any other part of the world.
Canada also brings real industrial capacity to the table. Ontario remains one of the most sophisticated auto manufacturing regions in the world, supported by decades of experience building vehicles for global brands. Its supplier networks, labor force, and logistical infrastructure are already integrated with global automakers. A Hyundai plant would plug seamlessly into this ecosystem. There is also the mineral advantage. Canada holds massive reserves of nickel, cobalt, copper, and lithium, the very resources required for EV batteries. At a time when the world is scrambling for secure and friendly supply chains, Canada offers Hyundai a natural, legally stable, geopolitically aligned source of battery materials. In that sense, Canada is not just an alternative to the US, it is a better aligned long-term fit. Diplomacy matters deeply in industries where supply chains stretch across continents. And here, the difference between Ottawa and Washington is stark. At APEC, Trump declined to meet Carney.
Carney responded by meeting Xi Jinping, Lee Jae-myung, and several Indo-Pacific leaders shaping the future of energy and manufacturing. His approach signaled that Canada is not operating in America's shadow, it is charting its own path. For Korea, Carney's tone mattered. It showed respect, predictability, and long-term alignment. When set against Trump's increasingly unpredictable rhetoric and punitive actions, Canada appeared calm and cooperative, two qualities Hyundai now values more than ever. Only a year ago, the idea of Hyundai opening a major plant in Canada seemed unrealistic. But after the Georgia raid, the logic shifted. Canada has the talent. It has the minerals. It has trade agreements that eliminate friction. It has political stability. It has a government focused on Asia, not hostile to it. And, unlike in the U.S., Hyundai would not need to worry about its workforce being detained on camera during a morning police sweep. What was once a hypothetical scenario now feels entirely plausible. If Hyundai announced that its next major EV or battery plant would be in Canada, the impact would be immediate and enormous. Economists would expect thousands of direct jobs and many more indirect positions across logistics, metals, minerals, parts manufacturing, research, and regional development. Provinces like Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia would compete aggressively for it, offering land, workforce guarantees, and incentives. Diplomatically, the symbolism would be even sharper. A major South Korean automaker shifting expansion from the U.S. to Canada would signal that American political risk is no longer tolerable. Other global manufacturers, Japanese, European, or Southeast Asian, would notice. They would begin running their own calculations, and Washington would find itself facing the consequences of its own unpredictability. For the U.S., this would not just be an economic loss, it would be a reputational blow. And for South Korea, it would mark the moment its corporations finally stopped absorbing the cost of American political chaos. And beyond the immediate numbers, the long-term implications could be transformational. A Hyundai plant would anchor new supply chain corridors, stimulate mining development in Canada's northern regions, and accelerate domestic battery research. It could also trigger a wave of follow-up investment from Korean suppliers, companies that traditionally cluster around Hyundai wherever it sets up shop. In effect, one decision from Hyundai could reshape Canada's entire industrial landscape for a generation, making the country a true North American manufacturing pillar rather than a peripheral player. Hyundai never wanted to rethink its North American strategy, but the United States forced that reconsideration upon them. The mass deportation raid cracked the foundation of trust. The inconsistent tariffs widened that crack, and every politically motivated enforcement action pushed Hyundai a little further away. Canada, meanwhile, has quietly positioned itself as the rational alternative, stable, predictable, globally connected, and diplomatically respectful. So now the question is simple. If Hyundai must choose between Trump's volatility and Carney's stability, why wouldn't it choose Canada? This is no longer unthinkable. This is increasingly logical, and it may soon become reality. Canada just pulled off one of its most confident power moves of the decade. Standing in northern British Columbia, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled 6 nation-shaping megaprojects that, together, mark the biggest shift in Canadian economic strategy since the early days of Confederation. And while the announcement was aimed squarely at Canadians, the political aftershocks traveled instantly across the border. Donald Trump, who has spent his second term escalating tariffs and lecturing Ottawa on dependence, suddenly faced a Canada that wasn't retreating or reacting. It was building, boldly, loudly, and on its own terms.
Strategy is to develop new trade and economic corridors that help us diversify our markets and build our independence. The Northwest Corridor has extraordinary potential to unlock critical minerals development, clean power transmission, all under Indigenous leadership. The corridor involves building new transmission lines, upgrading highways, installing fiber and cell towers, and investing in communities, ports, and railways. By doing so, will strengthen our position as a global leader in clean energy and a leader in critical minerals.
Carney's announcement, delivered at a BC hydro facility, was nothing short of a national blueprint. He introduced a clean energy strategy built on rapid tax incentives, a new productivity superdeduction, and the Canada Infrastructure Bank's $10 billion commitment to push clean power projects forward. He made clear that nuclear energy, long stuck in political limbo, would now play a central role, with small modular reactors and utility-scale nuclear entering the mainstream of Canada's future grid. The Prime Minister then shifted northward, revealing that the Iqaluit Hydro Project is being formally referred to the Major Projects Office. This isn't just a power project, it's the first fully Inuit-owned hydro development in Canadian history. It's expected to eliminate nearly $2 billion in diesel use over the next half-century and establish a new foundation for Arctic sovereignty at a time when international interest in the North is rising sharply. Coming just months after Trump's renewed fascination with Arctic real estate and U.S. military expansion in Alaska, the symbolism was unmistakable. Carney moved west again, this time toward the Northwest Critical Conservation Corridor, a sweeping vision that blends Indigenous-led economic development with one of the largest conservation undertakings on the planet. The corridor will open long-blocked access to the Golden Triangle's mineral deposits, reinforce transmission networks, modernize remote highways, expand fiber and cellular access, and create new rail and port capacity. The conservation area tied to the plan would be as large as Greece, a direct statement that Canada is capable of balancing growth with stewardship. To make that possible, the Canada Infrastructure Bank announced a $140 million loan for the North Coast Transmission Line, a crucial piece of infrastructure that will unlock LNG production, support multiple mining projects, and anchor a clean energy industrial corridor stretching across northern British Columbia. Carney highlighted that this line alone could create $10 billion in economic activity and reduce emissions by up to 3 million tons annually. The Prime Minister then turned to the global competition for critical minerals. Demand for these resources, nickel, graphite, tungsten, copper, and dozens more, is expected to rise five-fold by 2050. At the moment, production and processing are dangerously concentrated in one country, China. Carney made clear that Canada's geological wealth and political stability position it to become the world's most trusted supplier, especially as the United States struggles to stabilize its EV and industrial policies under Trump's unpredictable tariff regime. To accelerate this shift, Carney presented a new sovereign fund dedicated to critical minerals projects, a first and last mile infrastructure program, and expanded tax credits to help fast-track development. He highlighted 3 projects being sent to the Major Projects Office: Canada Nickel's Crawford Project in Ontario, Nouveau's Matawini Graphite Mine in Quebec, and Northcliffe's Sisson Tungsten Mine in New Brunswick. Each represents a pillar of a supply chain the world urgently needs. Crawford in particular, one of the largest nickel reserves globally, could set the benchmark for low-carbon, even carbon-negative mining. Carney concluded the event by connecting every project back to a larger narrative. Canada is entering a new era of nation-building, one defined by clean energy, northern sovereignty, Indigenous partnership, and economic independence rather than vulnerability to U.S. pressure. Carney's strategy lands at a moment when Donald Trump is relying on tariffs as the central tool of U.S. economic power. Washington has imposed sweeping duties across Canada's auto sector, steel, agriculture, lumber, and clean tech industries. But instead of playing defense, Carney is building the foundation of an industrial future that doesn't require America's permission. This is a structural counterpunch, one Trump did not expect. On Arctic sovereignty, the contrast is even sharper. The United States has increased northern deployments, revived long-dismissed discussions about controlling Greenland, and framed the Arctic as a strategic frontier. Carney's emphasis on an Inuit-owned hydro system wasn't accidental. It was a declaration that Canada intends to lead in its own north, not follow American priorities. Clean, local, and permanent energy infrastructure is far more powerful than any symbolic speech or diplomatic statement. It's sovereignty in physical form. On critical minerals, Canada is outpacing the United States in a race Washington claims to lead. Trump's tariffs on EV components were meant to drag investment back to American soil, but instead they've destabilized supply chains and discouraged automakers from committing to new facilities. Canada's approach, sovereign funds, long-term infrastructure, Indigenous equity, expedited permitting, and enormous grid expansions, looks like a country preparing for the next century, not the next election cycle. The U.S. remains dependent on global imports, exports. Canada is positioning itself to become the supplier everyone else depends on. The Northwest Corridor adds another strategic layer. If completed, it allows Canada to ship minerals, energy, and manufactured goods directly to global markets through Pacific ports, without relying on American transit routes. This is the part that truly rattles Trump's worldview. His tariff strategy is built on one assumption, that Canada needs America more than America needs Canada. A fully developed Northern Corridor undermines that assumption entirely. The indigenous ownership framework is an often overlooked but deeply consequential shift. By turning communities into shareholders rather than stakeholders, Carney is rewriting how Canada builds major projects. This stands in stark contrast to the U.S., where conflict between federal agencies and tribal nations often stalls development. Canada, under Carney's model, turns partnership into a competitive advantage. Finally, there's the national pride dimension. After years of reacting to tariffs, plant closures, and supply chain threats from Washington, Canada has been hungry for a moment that feels like forward motion. Carney's sixth project announcement captures that. It reframes the national conversation. Instead of worrying about Trump's next move, Canada is making its own.
Carney's 6 mega projects are more than infrastructure announcements. They're a statement of identity. They mark a Canada that is ready to build, ready to lead, and ready to assert its place in North America without asking for permission. Trump may escalate, Washington may push back, but something has shifted. For the first time in a long time, Canada isn't just responding to the world, it's shaping it. So, here's the question for viewers. Will these projects roll out fast enough to secure Canada's new position, or will Trump double down and try to pull the continent back into his orbit?
We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America. Nobody's going to get around that.
You're in the market to purchase a new car, buy one of those that are made by Canadian hands that possibly is made from the steel where I work in my home. So we're Canadian. We'll be proud of it. We don't want to be a 51st state. We're proud of that flag, that leaf.
Canada's steel industry just refused to fold, while the United States' own manufacturing supply chain is quietly paying the price. In this video, we'll show how Ottawa's bold budget moves and strategic pivot are turning a Trump-era tariff blitz into a Canadian comeback story. If you think tariffs are always a win for American industry, think again.
In 2025, U.S. President Donald J. Trump doubled down on his America First trade policy by imposing 50% tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, hitting allies like Canada with the same force as strategic rivals. For Canada, historically America's biggest steel supplier, the blow was severe. Algoma Steel, Stelco, and multiple mid-sized producers faced immediate pressure as the U.S. market, their largest export destination, suddenly became uneconomical. At the same moment, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, revealed his first budget, a sweeping industrial plan framed as a generational shift. This budget introduced a $10 billion loan facility to stabilize big manufacturers, a targeted tariff relief program for steel and aluminum, and, most importantly, a clear political declaration. Canada will reduce reliance on U.S. markets and build a self-sustaining industrial base. Meanwhile, the U.S. escalated further by expanding tariffs to more than 400 steel-related product categories, including wind turbines, EV components, and construction inputs. This triggered alarm bells across American industry, with warnings from auto giants, energy firms, and construction associations about rising costs and disrupted supply chains. The dynamic became clear. Trump tightened the screws, Canada adapted, and now the economic consequences are swinging back across the border.
The central misconception in Trump's tariff strategy is the belief that the U.S. can raise trade walls without disrupting the tightly woven North American industrial ecosystem it helped build. Canada's steel fight offers a real-time case study in why that belief is flawed.
Carney's government moved quickly to reposition steel as a national security asset rather than a simple export commodity. The new budget's Buy Canadian strategy ensures that steel from Sault Ste. Marie, Hamilton, or Regina doesn't sit idle waiting for U.S. political moods. It goes directly into Canada's own bridges, EV plants, naval upgrades, and transmission lines. Steel becomes part of a larger effort to give Canada sovereignty over the materials that power its economy. While Trump's political objective was to protect American steelworkers, the downstream reality is far more complicated. When U.S. automakers see input costs spike, when EV manufacturers delay production schedules, and when energy infrastructure builders report higher bids, the job losses ripple outward. Steel may gain stability in the U.S., but the broader industrial economy absorbs the blow. It's the classic tariff paradox: protect one sector, punish 10 others. Canada, meanwhile, is refusing to play the victim. Ottawa is actively building a domestic steel demand engine that can replace the lost U.S. market. Carney's budget doesn't hide its ambition. Create a Canadian industrial corridor capable of fully supplying the nation's energy transition, housing plan, defense upgrades, and northern infrastructure. That requires millions of tons of steel annually, and Canada plans to produce it internally. Here's the real turning point. Canada is no longer just reacting to tariffs. It is actively redesigning its economy so that U.S. pressure loses leverage. If America wants to weaponize access to its market, Canada will simply reduce its exposure to that weapon. And this shift is already visible. New domestic procurement rules, green steel investments, electric arc furnace conversions, and the rise of long-term Canada-first infrastructure planning.
Meanwhile, the United States is encountering the uncomfortable reality of tariff-driven inflation. Higher steel prices feed directly into higher auto prices, higher construction costs, and higher consumer costs. U.S. manufacturers must choose between overpriced domestic steel or tariff-inflated imports. Both options hurt competitiveness. Tariffs may play well at rallies, but they disrupt the backbone industries that actually determine America's economic strength. This leads to a deeper regional paradox. North America was built on integrated supply chains. For decades, steel crossed the border seamlessly, enabling both countries to manufacture at world-class efficiency. Trump's tariffs fracture this integration, and Canada, not the U.S., is proving more capable of adjusting. And that's what makes this moment historic. Canada is laying the foundation for a more independent industrial identity, while U.S. manufacturers face the destabilizing consequences of their own government's tariff policy. Canada's pivot is not merely defensive, it is transformational. Canada is positioning its steel industry as the anchor of a new national industrial strategy, one that supports everything from the country's clean energy ambitions to its Arctic security posture. In the new budget's fine print, steel is directly linked to hydro dam expansion, offshore wind fabrication, LNG terminal upgrades, EV battery plants, modernized rail corridors, and the mass housing push Ottawa is preparing to launch. That means the steel sector is no longer just reacting to global markets, it is being built into the heart of Canada's long-term economic architecture. In practice, this means a Canadian construction boom powered by Canadian steel, not imported inputs. It means warships built in Halifax with domestic steel plate, transmission towers in Alberta made from domestic beam steel, and Ontario's EV supply chain anchored by Hamilton's green steel transition. Every dollar Canada redirects inward reduces U.S. leverage. Every new domestic contract strengthens the argument that Canada doesn't need to accept economic pressure as the cost of living next to a superpower. Meanwhile, the U.S. is entering a dangerous loop. Tariffs raise costs. Higher suppress investment costs.
And suppressed investment makes America less competitive globally. Auto companies are already warning that price increases will reduce sales. Construction groups say infrastructure bids are rising. Renewable energy developers report higher steel-intensive project costs, threatening U.S. climate targets. This is the structural weakness Trump's policy never accounted for. America's strength comes from affordable inputs, not artificially inflated ones. Canada's defiance is exposing that flaw. By showing that a middle-power nation can withstand U.S. tariff aggression and even turn it into a growth strategy, Canada is proving something larger about the modern economy. Integration is a strength, but diversification is survival.
And Canada is choosing survival with surprising confidence. Canada's steel industry is proving something essential. Resilience is engineered, not improvised. Through investment, policy clarity, and strategic redirection, Canada is turning a tariff assault into an industrial pivot. Meanwhile, the United States, the architect of the pressure campaign, is discovering that economic walls cut both ways. So the real question becomes, who is actually winning the steel war? The country adapting or the country reacting? Canada may have already given us the answer.